This is Aldous Huxley saying they do have and will use mind manipulation techniques. Do have, will use, and they have an eye to the future of genetic engineering and standardization. Of course, that was again, 90 years ago almost. So.
Oh, something that was supposed to go click, click started going clack, clack. But naturally, I wouldn't know what.
And how lucky we are to be Gamma. After all,
to be good is Gamma, because Gamma is good. As select alphas, conditioned to believe without knowing and to know without believing, you have been chosen to view the surrogate revelations and synthetic mysteries upon which all perfect and placebo belief is founded.
This is about the basic power drive, and they know that in this system you have no real power, so the power has to be sublimated with idle pleasures, hobbies, sports, and basically false talents and false achievements and little rabbit holes for people to get themselves stuck in. But the whole concept itself, using this feedback mechanism of self-indulgence, this larger concept is purely cybernetic. They want to produce, ideally anyway, human beings who are socially conditioned to become standardized machine minders for standardized machines. Of course, we know by today's standards that the standardized machines are doing most of the minding, not so much the other way around. But
everyone is adjusted. Everyone has been conditioned to want to do the work he has to do.
We're not too stupid and we're not too bright. To be a Gamma is to be just right.
And thus everyone is perfectly happy, perfectly content.
Deltas all have lots of fun. Deltas get to play and run.
The point is, the shaping of human beings for the society of the future, for the scientifically managed society, is rather pronounced. And Huxley has such a sly way of acknowledging that the science has actually been around a lot longer than people are aware of. It's basically been suppressed because these sciences have been ridiculed in past centuries. And that actually is a really interesting subpart of this whole ordeal, where he acknowledges that, about 150 years passed by where nobody would take seriously the idea of hypnotism because of the smear basically against mesmerism and the resistance to any of these other scientists and doctors who were trying to relieve pain during surgery, that kind of thing. That's especially true of James Braid and James Esdale that he names, that they refuse to take a serious look at it.
I'm a doctor of the Viennese Faculty of Medicine. My name is Franz Anton Mesmer.
Doctor, you flatter us.
Joseph Balsamo had captured the interest of Dr. Mesmer, who was striving in vain for the scientific recognition of his great discovery, the curative powers of hypnotism.
And without really taking a deep dive into it, it's really interesting how sort of disingenuous that was. The discrediting of Mesmer's animal magnetism in the late 18th century. He had a very big following. It's even been said in some of these newspaper accounts that, quote, 1 out of 4 doctors were mesmerists. There were crowds being attracted to basically see Mesmer treat, or if you look at it the other way around, perform, his sort of act, and let people who are basically highly suggestible to begin with feel like they have these effects. That was kind of the public perception put on mesmerism. As Huxley points out, there is and always was something to it. To what degree was Mesmer charlatan and showman? I'm not going to get into that level of it, but the underlying basis for his animal magnetism was at least sound to some degree.
Joseph, without knowing it, for years, you have been practicing hypnotism.
Hypnotism?
Yes.
I never even heard of the word.
Very few have. But it's an art which was forgotten when the world grew old.
Was his actual treatment itself the full articulation of that? I don't know the full story, but it is interesting because Mesmer was actually an associate of Adam Weishaupt of the very real group Bavarian Illuminati. He was in France in the pre-revolutionary days, and a lot of sources have gone a long way to establish the connection between the Bavaria, Germany-based Illuminati and the events leading up to the the French Revolution. There's definitely a connection there. And Mesmer was often said to be sort of a screen for attracting elite and talented men and women. By putting on public talks, they were widely attended, and then basically recommendations could be made behind the scenes for people who might be of use further within the organization. That said, it's very interesting that Mesmer did a lot of his work with the glass harmonica because it was invented by Benjamin Franklin.
What we've got here is a scaled-down version. It is original, although that, for example, is 37 bowls. This is 25. So I'm just going to give you a little sound of it. Right, so when that was played properly by the real people at the time, it was fingers in water, dipped into chalk, and then you played sort of like 10 fingers across at the time, so you could make a far more harmonious sound than that.
And because Benjamin Franklin was one of the people assigned to the panel, the Royal Medical Panel, to investigate Mesmer and ultimately to discredit him.
Mesmer uses Franklin's invention to put people in a trance. While he's in France, because Mesmer is a Frenchman, while Franklin is in France, he's part of a committee that investigates Mesmer, and they then decide he's a fraud.
It was an appointed body of King Louis XVI, and ironically or not, it also included Dr. Guillotine, whose name was later applied to the guillotine. It had the chemist Antoine Lavoisier, the astronomer Jean-Sylvain Bailly, and the American ambassador and scientist Benjamin Franklin, who knew Mesmer and who had at least an acquaintanceship with him. And there were sort of conflicting ideas about the mental effects of the glass harmonica and the effect of animal magnetism, and on and on.
I think you're on the right track with that.
Cool. That was good.
So the sound is a little bit weird. Sometimes people find it a bit nerve-wracking.
But at the end of the day, they did a blindfold test of a man who supposedly claimed to be under the effects of mesmerism, but couldn't even distinguish between whether the practitioner was there or not. And quite frankly, what I remember of the story seemed like kind of a snow job, a whitewash investigation just to kind of shut down public credibility for Mesmer. And at the end of the day, his work had some kind of legitimate scientific basis that was ignored publicly. Publicly, it was discredited. And despite the affiliation of lots of scientific men of the day, was discredited. And yet, all these years later, people still think it's discredited when hypnotism and its basis in mesmerism have been upheld. They've been demonstrated. It's become easy to do, and it's clinically significant. It's not just a circus stage trick, you know. I mean, it's just amazing because I think the public mind associates hypnotism in the same way that it was meant to associate mesmerism as sort of a stage trick, an exercise in public gullibility, you know, incredible claims and everything. And yet hypnotism is a reliable, legitimate part of psychotherapy of various kinds. And it just basically reflects a state of suggestibility that's easily achieved not only with drugs, as Huxley mentions, but with the television, with the actual signal.
Videodrome signal will ultimately produce and control hallucination to the point that it will change human reality.
Videodrome is a bioelectronic addiction.
It's clear you have a history of manipulation.
And I think it's significant indeed that Huxley goes on to argue that Orwell, while he presents a good book in 1984, is ultimately wrong because all the effort, all the inefficient means of kicking and flogging people into obedience would ultimately modulate into the nightmare of Brave New World. It would modulate into a world dominated by the domination of psychology and physiology and cybernetics. It would modulate from a 1984 iron fist tyranny into one that was bureaucratically invisible, into one that appeased people at a physiological and psychological level into believing they were in a blissful state when they're not.
And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
They modulate. It's an instrument of government. Modulate. When you look up the dictionary definition of modulate, and I think I've got the 1941 edition in front of me, it reads, to adjust or regulate by a certain proportion. It gets things into a certain proportion. A temper, to soften. Definition 2, to tune to a certain key or pitch, vary or change the frequency as of an electrical wave by imposing upon them others or another, usually of a lower frequency. As a verb, to modulate the tones as in singing. In music, to pass by regular chord or melodic progression as from one key to another. In radio, to produce modulation. The modulation of the 1984 tyranny system into the Brave New World system is literally shifting the instrument of government, the tuning of the mechanism that governs society. It's a shift of key. It's a shift of musical frequencies, very much in a Pythagorean sense that the universe is made up in chords and specific frequencies. You know, Huxley is talking about such a shift psychologically and physiologically that it's a modulation into the other world. It's a shifting of keys. You know, it's not just that Orwell missed a few notes, if you will, because of things he didn't know. It's that he didn't understand the way in which the instrument of the system could change its key altogether to be more harmonious, to be more resonant with the larger social organism that they wanted to build, and to put people in harmony with that. I think that's very interesting. I think it's very interesting indeed.
Kitchen. E flat. Why do people act the way they do? There's a reason.
This is you. You resonate on an ultra-low frequency. She resonates on an ultra-high frequency.
I don't want her to be an experiment.
Sound influences the way that people connect with each other.
He is literally out of sync with the natural world.
There's something deeper at work.
You are a slave born into a prison for your mind.
I mean, they're not conscious of it, but it's there.
This was all about conditioning and hypnotizing people. It's about getting people used to a state in a nervous, physiological sense, and about making them suggestible to accept that state and combining those many times over. Within the next generation, I believe the world's rulers will discover that infant conditioning and narco-hypnosis are more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons, and that the lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting people into loving their servitude as by flogging and kicking them into obedience. In other words, George Orwell, I'm right, you're wrong. That's Aldous Huxley in 1949. And as it happens, George Orwell did not live very much longer. He died the next year in 1950, only 2 or 3 months after receiving this letter in October 1949 from Huxley, who had once been his tutor in French at the Eton boarding school and who was very much his sort of mentor and supposed superior in the intellectual circles of Britain. And for all the merits of Orwell's book, this letter was a very in-your-face admission that no, Huxley's on the inside track and they have something else planned for us. This is very much about an elite, secretive scientific body calling the shots, and Julian Huxley himself talked about this. This paper, Julian Huxley and the Continuity of Eugenics in the 20th Century Britain, besides being really interesting anyway, from 2015, makes the point several times over that, quote, Julian Huxley was interested in establishing an international network of elite intellectuals. Huxley organized a study group to, quote, study the problem of a possible new ideology appropriate to the present situation of society at large. Huxley wanted this to be an interdisciplinary and yet also a secret and anonymous group, linking high-powered thinkers with practical activities. These are the advisory boards that make minute decisions about policy topics ranging from A to Z, that are too dull for the public to even know about, and which the public doesn't have the purview or the jurisdiction to even influence. This is about an elite body here. And it says this was Huxley in elitist mode. In my opinion, just about the only mode he knows. That's Julian Huxley, and I just don't think that Aldous Huxley fell all that far from the family tree there. The things they wrote about very much overlapped, and again, Julian Huxley's agenda lines up pretty directly with Brave New World Revisited and with the original Brave New World. So, anyway, pretty interesting, I think.
Very good. But do you wish you had been incubated as alphas?
No.
Excellent. That's all.